Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's Mayor Weinstein. It's a pleasure to have you here again on a Wednesday night. We have very important issues to talk about tonight. But first, before anything, I'm going to ask whoever is joining us tonight if you could please share this with the various pages and groups that you're part of on Facebook and other social media platforms. We'll reach a lot more people. We have a special guest with us, Mayor Jolowitz, who was the director of the Zionist Organization of the United States of America, and who was also a former chairman of the Jewish Defense League. Here's his bio, so take a look at it. And again, I'm asking everyone, share this with the various pages and groups that you're part of. We'll reach a lot more people on Facebook, on YouTube, on other platforms as well. As we do every week for the show, we start off with a summary of the Parsha. And last week's Parsha, in every synagogue, we read from the Torah, and we're talking about, we were discussing an affliction to the Jewish people. Some people caught it, most people didn't, and what they have to do to remedy it, and the affliction was called saras. And a lot of people interpret this as like a skin affliction, as psoriasis, something like this. It's not, but there's a similarity. And the rabbis talk about what is the cause of it. And the rabbis and sages, they all agree. They say the main cause of this affliction was lashon hara, speaking ill of your fellow Jew. So in the shul, in the synagogue that I go to, I was in a discussion with the rabbi there, and I asked the rabbi the following question. I said, what is the worst form of lashon hara, evil talk? Speaking ill about your fellow Jew, or speaking ill about the land of Israel, about Eretz Israel? And he looks at me and he says, and pay attention. And I qualified the question because when the Jews left Egypt under Moses, that Moses sent out the spies to look into the land of Israel to see if there's any fortifications, any threats. And the spies, the majority of them, 10 of the spies, came back with an ill report of entering the land, and only 2 stood up and said, the land is good, exceedingly good, let's go in, let's conquer it, let's take it. But the 10 overruled him and overruled the 2. And because of that, the Jewish people, that generation had to die out. They were punished. They died out in the desert, and the next generation entered under Joshua, entered into Israel. So there's precedent for asking that question to the rabbi. What is the most severe form of lashon hara? And the rabbi turns to me and he says, nowadays, anti-Semitism is so rampant, and the Jews are referred to in a collective sense, Israel. They're blaming all the ills of the world on Israel, on Zionism. They say the evils of Zionism and so on and so forth. So therefore, of course, it's much more severe for a Jew to speak ill about Israel, about the state of Israel, 100%. And that's what we're going to be discussing about tonight, is that there's this organization called J Street. And J Street just had a convention where they brought in a number of speakers, and every single speaker at their conference was bashing Israel. They call themselves a pro-Israel organization. They say they have nothing to do with the BDS, but yet they actually enable the BDS, they justify the BDS, they come out against the issue of the statement, against the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. They're lobbying congressmen and congresswomen, members of Congress, to threaten Israel with sanctions against various policies. They provided a platform for Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the PA. And our guest is going to be discussing Mahmoud Abbas and his past and what you need to know about him. But they provided a platform for him. And he was asking at the convention, at the conference in his talk, to lobby the government in the United States to declassify the PLO as a terror organization. Take them off the list. That's one demand he had. They present him as everything good, as a rank and file Democrat, peace-loving, and they present Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, as an evil warmonger. We're going to be talking about that. Also, we're going to be talking about there's been an upsurge in attacks against Jews in Israel from Arabs. And, we're going to discuss that issue as well. The land of Israel, all of it, belongs to the Jewish people, 100%. It's our land. There are many Arab countries, huge countries. They want little tiny Israel. They want that one little tiny Jewish state wiped out. We have to speak the truth. We're going to be speaking the truth. Let me welcome in Mayor Jolowitz, and let's talk. Can our doctor in the studio enable? Here we go. Mayor, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. A pleasure.
It's been so many years since, God, it brings back memories. I was at your wedding in Israel so many years ago.
Yes.
You were married by Rabbi Kahana, and remember when you assumed the chairmanship of the JDL. We had a conference in New York, convention with various leaders of JDL. It was great back then. It goes back. This is in the early 80s.
Yes, it was 81, 82, and 83. And I will tell you that the only change, it's interesting. I'm in Phoenix, Arizona now. When I left Phoenix in order to go to New York to be the national chairman of the Jewish Defense League, I was pretty active in lecturing about two items. One was anti-Semitism, mostly in America, and the other was obviously the issue of Israel. The only thing that's changed, I came back after 34 years of having returned to Israel and different assignments and also in New York. I came back 34 years later, which was a couple of years ago, and I continue to talk about the same two subjects, about anti-Semitism and about Israel. Because as the French philosopher said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The only difference, and we'll touch upon that today, is that the anti-Semitism of yesteryear that we were involved in was basically anti-Semitism which had come from the right. That anti-Semitism continues, of course, unabated, but it's anti-Semitism from the left that we're most concerned about today. And that anti-Semitism manifests itself most readily in the form of anti-Zionism.
How prevalent do you see it in the United States on campuses?
On campuses, it's a terrible thing for me to say. It's not within the Jewish, it's a lost cause. The professional propagandist that represents the other side is well-financed, but that isn't the issue. They're well-trained. They believe in their cause. And it's something we began to see, 2 or 3 decades ago with a Jewish student on campus. And Jewish students were always the smartest student. But when it came to the issue of Israel, they either didn't defend it, they didn't know it. There was a concern that a number of years ago, the Jews didn't know what causes to support, because Jews, of all the isms the Jews are supposed to support, Judaism isn't the one, it's liberalism. And as such, on the college campus today, the Jew is taking a terrible beating, and I don't mean physically, they're taking a difficult beating, and the people who are supposed to be the safeguards of Jewish destiny on American campuses, the whole Hillel International program, is a disaster. In fact, Rabbi Kahana referred to it many years ago as a spiritual Holocaust on campus, because the rabbis who were supposed to, in fact, lead the Jewish students and give them a certain sense of direction and pride were completely morally bankrupt. And over the years, we see, I lecture quite regularly here, and I lecture to people who have sons, daughters, and some of them grandchildren who today are on the college campuses. And they tell me that their sons and daughters, if they're of college age, or grandchildren, actually don't want the grandparents to talk about Israel. They actually say, can we talk about something else? We're not interested in Israel. And as we proceed, there's a certain study which I want to cite, which will sort of put things in perspective. But we have a major problem. Obviously, the Jews in America.
Let me ask you a question, and then you'll start.
No, please.
With that. So when you mentioned the Hillels, and I mentioned there was this J Street conference, and J Street, they have what's called on campus J Street U.
Yes.
And J Street U has been pressuring Hillel groups to have a new type of Hillel called Open Hillels.
Right.
Which embraces BDS, Jewish Voice for Peace, and et cetera, et cetera. So when you're going to go on about the study and all that, can you elaborate, include this?
Yes, in fact, yeah, I will. In fact, let me begin. I've got two quotations that I have in front of me. I often cite, it's interesting when I speak about Israel, I hardly ever cite Jewish quotes, Jewish cause. I always cite the other side. They're the one. That's all we need to do is tell us what the Arabs are saying. In this particular case, there are two quotations, or there are two things that I want to cite, which relate to J Street U. The first one is, and it's only gotten worse since then, but I use this as an example because people don't understand what J Street is. And it's important that I establish this footnote. The leaders, the spokesmen of J Street know exactly what they're doing. They're presenting a program and an agenda which is meant to defeat Israel. Period. To defeat Israel. Yet a lot of the people who follow J Street, whether at the college level or others, even I met someone when I came back to Phoenix a couple of years ago who we perchance bumped into each other, and he was thrilled to tell me, because he knew that I was an activist, a Zionist, a pro-Israel, and he was thrilled to tell me that he was giving big money, he was a wealthy man, to Jewish organizations that relate to Israel. And I said, that's wonderful. He said, yeah, I just gave a very sizable check to, he goes, what's the name? I forget. He goes, it's a group that, he goes, it begins with a J. And I said, J Street? And he goes, yeah, that's it, J Street. So here was a gentleman who was a Zionist who didn't know enough about J Street. He gave a check for $5,000 is what he gave. And when I told him what J Street was, he was startled, he was concerned and everything else. Here, let me just give you this. 2015, the president of J Street U in 2015 was Amna Faruqi. Amna Faruqi. Sounds like a nice Yiddish name, right? From Amna Faruqi was a Muslim from Pakistan, was the president of J Street U, okay? And came out and basically said that the reason that they opposed Israel was it was their form of resistance on behalf of the Palestinians against Israel. Let's move ahead 2 years, 2017. This is interesting. Testifying at the House Judiciary Committee, which was investigating anti-Semitism on college campuses, the then president of J Street U, claimed, now listen to this, I'm quoting, it's unfair to describe those who seek to end Israel's existence as anti-Semitic. It's a mind-boggling comment that it's unfair to describe those who seek to end Israel's existence as anti-Semitic. Who made that statement? It was Zoe Goldblum. November of 2017, she was a senior at Stanford, obviously not a dummy. She was a senior at Stanford and was the head of the National Student Board of J Street. This is what we have. We have lost that because the left has, in fact, stolen the hearts and minds of the student on campus. And the parents at home aren't rich enough or strong enough in their understanding of Israeli and Jewish and Zionist politics to be able to somehow give them what they need in order to defend Israel. It's not there. It's not there. If you wish, if you wish, I don't want to just pontificate, but if you wish, I want to make reference to the survey because it gives us a background. There was a study done. I'm actually pulling out the numbers, even though I've used them so often that I've actually memorized them. It was the most It was the most complete study that was ever done about American Jews and their political proclivities. And the survey was done 2012, right? It was before the presidential election of 2012. And among many, many, many questions which were asked, I isolated 3 questions, all which dealt with the same issue. And the question which was asked of a large sampling of American Jews only was the following. This is question 7A. And it says, among the following list of choices, what is the most important issue for you in deciding how you will vote in the 2012 election? And what they did is they gave 11 different topics that people could choose as the one piece that they most relied on in order to pick the president. And they were national security, there was the economy, there was healthcare, there was immigration, there was energy, there was taxes, social security, abortion, the Iranian nuclear situation, and also Israel, the issue of Israel. So the question is asked, which of these is the most important thing in determining who you vote for president? Economy was number 1, and so on and so forth. Let me just cut to the chase because time is precious. 4.5% of those surveyed, 4.5%, said that Israel was the most important issue for their choosing a president of the United States. So the survey, brilliantly done, asks the question again. This is question 7B. So it asked, among the following list of choices, what's the second most important issue for you in deciding who you will vote for president of the United States? And once again, Jews, American Jews, voted for other issues. Abortion was more important to them than Israel. The second time that they were given an opportunity to put Israel into play, 4.2% said Israel was the most important. Okay, finally, third question, question 7C. It asked the question again. Among the following list of choices, what's the third most important issue in choosing who you choose for president? And Israel came in with 6.1%. What's the takeaway? The takeaway is when the question is asked 3 times, when given 3 opportunities, and an American Jewish audience was asked, what do you look at when you choose the president of the United States? After 3 opportunities, it was less than 15% collectively. So this notion of American Jews are concerned about Israel and what happens to Israel needs to be put to bed. They are not concerned about Israel. And therefore, we should not be surprised when whoever runs for president of the United States, if they have a D after their name, if they're a Democrat, they will get 75% of the American Jewish vote. It doesn't matter. If Ilhan Omar, if Rashida Tlaib were running for president of the United States, whatever, if they have a D behind their name, Donald Trump, the best president that Israel has ever had, the best that Israel will ever have, whatever issues you have with him personally, the best that Israel has ever had, simply didn't influence American Jews. You would think that a person with a resume as rich as his was, and with the embassy, with the defunding the Palestinians, with everything that he's done, you would think if nothing else, those people who think that Israel's important would have voted for him. He got 24% of the vote, of the Jewish vote.
And that was primarily from the religious community.
And it was primarily from the religious community. That's exactly right. Had it not been for the religious community, then that percentage would have been, it would have been more disgraceful. That's exactly right. Yeah.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. We just see our doctor in the studio. Do we have any video about the J Street conference?
I don't have some videos, but I have some little information I thought would be appropriate.
Yes.
So we're going to start off with just a quick background to the meeting itself. And basically, we look at the invited speakers. It's essentially a who's who of Jew haters, both the alt-left Jew haters and the Palestinian Jew haters. So, kind of we look through the invited guests. I mean, here we have some of them. Reverend Warnock, who preaches that Jesus was a poor Palestinian prophet. We have people saying that who's funding Israel in the U.S. People saying that throwing rocks and firebombs are fine. So I'm going to show one quick video, which I think is interesting, because this is one of the guest speakers invited to this little conference. So if you bear with me for a minute, let's see if I could find it here.
But we saw the government of Israel shoot down unarmed Palestinian sisters and brothers like birds of prey. And I don't care who does it. It's wrong. It's wrong to shoot down God's children like they don't matter at all. And it's no more anti-Semitic for me to say that than it is anti-white for me to say that black lives matter. Palestinian lives matter. We need a Pentecostal moment.
Well, that's one of the guest speakers. I'll show you a couple of others, which I thought were particularly interesting. How about this gentleman, who is past leader of the Hadash party, member of the Joint List, the far-left anti-Zionist and self-proclaimed anti-Zionist coalition. He received $20,000 from the PLO under Arafat. You know, he's seen here with Jahar, who's the head of the PFLP, who we know is associated with a variety of groups that aren't particularly fond of you and I. We could look at this gentleman, another guest speaker at the meeting, who's a blatant leader from Bethlehem, a long record of anti-Israel sentiments. The list goes on. This could take a whole hour in itself. So I'll kind of, move along a little quicker. We have these two guest speakers at this week's J Street conference, a leader of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, but in Middle East peace, of course, ending the occupation and a full right of return for Palestinian refugees, which basically means the end of the state of Israel. We can go on with this, but I think particularly interesting are the people they have speak. They like to have token political Jews because it thinks it gives them some sort of validity. So, of course, without Bernie Sanders, how would this be? So I have a good poster of Bernie I thought you might appreciate. Those are Bernie's babes of the BDS. There he is with all of them, hugging him, welcoming him, kissing them. And that's who they identify as a good Jew, a good supporter of Israel.
It's unbelievable. It's
Your time is precious. Let me mention some names. Mahmoud Abbas, okay, president of the Palestinian Authority with a rich history. His history is he was Arafat's deputy for 3 decades. When Abbas became the head of the PA, Abbas has this record as well. Abbas was the financier. He financed the Munich Olympic massacre in 1972. Mahmoud Abbas got his PhD in Moscow as a Holocaust denier. Mahmoud Abbas in 1984 wrote a book in which he basically said that there was no Holocaust, but if there was, in a limited scale, it was because the Zionists conspired with Hitler in order to create either a massacre of Jews or a pretend massacre of Jews in order to justify their claim to Israel. This is the same Mahmoud Abbas who's the one who said that even if we're down to the last dollar, the pay for slay that we've often spoken about, he's the one who's orchestrated the pay for slay. That there's an actual legend that tells you, based on the level of crime, that the more Jews that you've killed, the more money you're compensated. And he's told the Biden administration that he will not end that. When they said that you need to end that in order for us to once again negotiate with you, his comment was, well, all monies are fungible. Why don't you give it to us for humanitarian aids and don't worry how we give it? This is the same Mahmoud Abbas who has named schools, he's named soccer stadiums, he's named city squares in the Palestinian areas after murderers of Jews. Mahmoud Abbas was an honored invitee to speak at this year's. He wasn't the only one. Ayman Oda, an Israeli Arab, head of the Arab Joint List, spoke there, and others and others and others. When you talk about the Jews, as Gary mentioned, you talk about the Jews who invited. These are Jews. There are 2 types of anti-Semites we're talking about today. The one is the non-Jewish anti-Semite, and the other one is the Jewish anti-Semite, the Salvators.
Speaking of the Olympics, let me cut in and show you a quick, very short little video of how the Palestinians feel so sorrowful for the Olympics. I thought this might kind of brighten everyone's day. And you could talk over this if you have any particular comments.
48 عاما على اغتيال القادة الثلاثة محمد يوسف النجار أبو يوسف النجار وكمال ناصر وكمال عدوان. ليلة 10 من نيسان عام 73 باتت ذكرى أليمة بفقدان 3 من أبرز قادة الثورة الفلسطينية الذين باستشهادهم قدمت حركة فتح والثورة أروع صفحات الفخر والاعتزاز والوفاء. وهكذا غابت أجساد الشهداء الثلاثة الأبرار عن ساحة الثورة الفلسطينية المستمرة جيلا بعد جيل لدحر الاحتلال وانتزاع حقوقنا الفلسطينية المشروعة، بينما تبقى السيرة العطرة حاضرة لتكون البوصلة دوما في البقاء على الثوابت الوطنية.
And long been denied is the obvious association between the Germans and the Palestinians. Well, later on we'll talk about back in history, but just most recently, I mean, this has all been disclosed that, they denied their involvement. Palestinians claim today that they were trying to help us and protect us and hide us. We know those are blatant lies.
Yeah. I have a radio show that I do as well. I know how quickly, in fact, it was scientifically proven that during the hour that I'm on the radio on Sunday, that 60 minutes runs faster than any other time. So let me throw this in for the audience because there's a video that's available, and many of you might have seen it. It's always worth seeing again. It's a video that's available free. It's an hour-long documentary that's available on YouTube called The J Street Challenge. The J Street Challenge is a series of talking heads which basically expose J Street as an organization which uses the pretense of its tagline, pro-Israel, pro-peace. It is neither pro-Israel and it is not pro-peace. It's a thing worth seeing. It must be seen. It's a number of years old, but it needs to be seen. It's completely relevant today, but especially today because we now have a Biden administration which has now opened its doors to J Street and is actually has congratulated J Street on the efforts. They will now rely on J Street as the American Jewish organization that they claim that they want to talk to in deciding what they do vis-a-vis Israel. So again, the J Street challenge, it's on YouTube. It's 1 hour long. It's powerful, and it must be seen.
Amazing. Listen, we have this is a phone in as well. So whoever is watching, please call if you have a question, if you have a comment, no problem. We'll take your call. The phone number to call is 647-510-5535. Call. We're available for you. I see Alan is joining us now. Is Alan there? Can't hear him. Guess he could hear us. But
there we go.
And there's
Alan. Let me introduce you to Mayor Jolowitz.
Okay, there he is.
Mayor, it's an honor to meet you, sir. Good. Okay. So I came in hearing you talk about the J Street Challenge. So I guess I'm coming in a good conversation. I don't know if you had a chance.
Let me give a quick introduction, just so people who are just tuning in know kind of what we're talking about here.
I'm sorry. Just allow me to interject. Alan, we met once before. It was at lunch. My daughter, Sarah, in West Hempstead.
God bless you.
Well, here's Alan joining us tonight.
Wait a second.
Will be Betrayed, among other things. He's the co-host of the Definitive Rap. So be sure to watch the Definitive Rap. He's been a political activist and congressional advisor for over 30 years. He's done some amazing things. So don't forget to watch the Definitive Rap. And let's get back to Alan.
Wait a second. Back up.
Okay.
Are you in Arizona?
I am indeed.
Oh my God! Okay, so this is a reunion of sorts. It's great to see you again.
And thank you, Alan. And I have your book on my shelf. Yes.
Oh my God! It's great to see you again.
Thank
I told you, Mayor and Gary, you always get the best guests.
Oh,
I had lunch with this guy, and it was terrific. It's great to see you again.
Well, we need to have great guests to balance out Mayor and myself.
No one can ever balance out you guys, but no, it's terrific. So again, I'm just catching up now, and I apologize. But as you know, this past Sunday and Monday was the J Street conference, and it was painful to watch as they just become more and more emboldened. They were always critical of Israel, but they weren't as aggressive or as proud of it as they are now. Where now they're actually saying, with a straight face, we should withhold support for Israel. I don't know if you saw this, but Jeremy Ben-Ami was very proud to give Jimmy Carter the Shalom B'Tzedek Award.
That's right. Can I throw this in, Alan? I don't mean to interrupt. You mentioned Jimmy Carter, and you mentioned J Street. I just want to throw this in as a very relevant background. In April of 1977, so we're going back to Jimmy Carter days, Undersecretary of State George Ball penned a significant piece that appeared in Foreign Policy, which was titled "Saving Israel in Spite of Herself." Saving Israel in spite of herself. It was a shift, a seismic shift, which today is actually employed by all the Democrats. And as you mentioned, Alan, also J Street, they believe that they don't believe. They're pretending that what they're doing is in Israel's best interest. So the whole notion of saving Israel in spite of herself basically tells Israel, why don't you step aside? We will tell you what you need to do in order to achieve the type of peace that we will now define for you.
Of course.
And part of it, I'm sorry, Alan, was exactly what you said. There was the implied threat. It was more than implied by George Ball that if Israel doesn't play the game as is expected, then there will be financial repercussions for your actions or lack of.
Right. And they always say, that we're concerned about Israel's security. They should live in secure borders. They should live, they should be a Jewish democracy. But there's never any standards to how a Palestinian state would be. It's in America's best interest to have an Arab country that will live as a democracy aside from Israel, that they can live in dignity. And again, you saw this time even more than ever. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, presidential candidates who ran. You have Jamie Raskin, who's Jewish. J Street has mainstreamed Israel bashing, and you can do it, and we will protect you from being called an anti-Semite. J Street now claims that they have endorsed over 50% of the Democrat members of Congress. And they all talk about, as you said, it's tough love for Israel. They love Israel more than Israel loves itself. It's Bibi Netanyahu who has brought Israel down or taken them to a radical seismic shift. Chuck Schumer came on and just attacked Donald Trump as the worst president. No acknowledgement of recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. No acknowledgement of the Abraham Accords. It was 2 days of bashing Israel. Mahmoud Abbas was a guest speaker also this year.
That's right. Ayman Odeh from the Arab Joint List. You mentioned Chuck Schumer. There's the perfect example of duplicity. When the Iran nuke deal was being discussed in 2015, Chuck Schumer was one of the last people to weigh in. He said, the document was 151 pages long, and he said, it's going to take me a while to read the document, as if he's an expert on nuclear military capability. What he did is he waited for Obama to signal him, we have enough votes to get it passed. Once he said that we have enough votes to get it passed, Chuck Schumer gave his symbolic, I'm troubled by it, I don't think it's in Israel's best interest. It was completely duplicitous. It was completely phony. How do we know? Because in 2018, when Trump abrogated the arrangement, the agreement, the person who wrote the most vitriolic letter condemning Donald Trump for getting rid of the deal was Chuck Schumer.
Right.
That's the real Chuck Schumer. Peter Beinart was one of the people who was there in a panel with J Street. Peter Beinart appears on CNN a few months ago in a panel discussing Israel. And Peter Beinart always does this. They always use the license of their their being Jewish. Peter Beinart says to the audience on CNN, it's important that you understand three things. First, I'm Jewish. Second, my children go to a Jewish day school. Third, I'm an active member of my synagogue. Now, having said this was the sentence. Now, having said that, I will tell you that I fully understand why the Palestinians engage in terrorism against Israel. When the non-Jewish person sitting next to him said, "You understand why Palestinians engage in terrorism against Jews after you've described yourself?" And he said, "Well, let me qualify. I don't fully endorse it, but I certainly understand it."
Well, he said the same thing about 9/11. Yes, it was a terrible thing, but we have to understand that it was our policies that set everything in motion. He spoke again this year. He was on a panel. I forgot who the two other participants were, but one of them was a Muslim who says that he supports the BDS movement. And he said BDS is a non-violent. He said at first we were criticized for being violent. So now we support BDS, which is non-violent. And Beinart says, listen, I don't support BDS, but again, when you have a panel, and this was back in 2015, and you referenced my book, one of the speakers then was Marsha Friedman, who said that the Jews took their land. The Jews have no right to Israel. It's Palestinian land, and any Jew who wishes to remain will live here as a protected minority. So those are the kinds of speakers you have at a J Street convention. They call themselves pro-Israel and pro-peace. So pro-Israel they're not, because every speaker accuses Israel of human rights violations and of being occupied. They showed videos. There was a 22-minute video showing, again, edited clips, very selective, of Israeli troops in Hebron abusing Palestinians. They had a segment where they gave the platform to breaking the silence. And then, on top of all that, then they call those pro-peace. Well, not one of them calls out Palestinian terrorism. Not one of them said anything about the Palestinians and the pay-for-slave program. Not one of them said anything about the Palestinians whose education curriculum incites violence against Israelis, teaches little Palestinian nursery and kindergarten students about, the flowery language of, we will grow flowers from the blood of our enemies. You know how they talk over there. But this is what a J Street convention does, and this is why they're so dangerous. And when they first came out many years ago, the Israeli government would not recognize them. This year, you had members from the Meretz Party, you had members of the Labor Party, and you had Ehud Olmert speaking. You had former leaders of Shin Bet speaking there. So even if they didn't totally adopt the J Street line, by their appearing there, they are giving legitimacy to J Street.
Recognize J Street, and that's the reason you've got these losers, the Ehud Olmert, Ehud Barak. You have all these people coming in there. Obviously, the Meretz Party represents. They are. What they don't touch upon is this fact: Mahmoud Abbas and the PA has basically told us, one doesn't have to search far to find this, that if they were to negotiate with Israel a two-state solution or a two-state illusion, there were certain preconditions that need to be met. Israel needed to understand that the two-state solution, illusion, would in essence mean that Israel must go back to the pre-67 borders as a opening salvo. The pre-67 borders are misnamed or mischaracterized as pre-67. They are the 1949 armistice lines. It means that Jerusalem will become the capital of Palestine. It means that all refugees would be repatriated. These are who created the refugee problem. There were no refugees in 1947. They were created in 1948. But the last thing was that the state of Palestine would be established. And this is the part that no one in J Street would ever say. The Arabs have told us definitively time and again that when Palestine is established, wherever it is fully established, it will be Judenrein. There'll be no Jews. It'll be free of Jews. So the question was asked, do you expect Israel to keep its Arab population and Palestine will have no Jews living there, with the presupposition that settlers who wanted to stay in Palestine? The Palestinians dodged the question because for them, the creation of the state of Palestine isn't in Judea, Samaria. It's not in the West Bank and Gaza. It is in Israel proper. It is all of it. And their literature tells us that wherever you look, and we fail to make our case because we never talk about the fact that according to the Arabs, all of Israel is occupied. The mistake that we have made, our side has often boasted, wow, Bibi Netanyahu, there were 3 prime ministers who've offered the Palestinians, we're told, and it's a misuse of language, we've offered them 95, 96, and 97.5% of the occupied territories. And we don't understand why they don't bite, why they don't accept. And the answer is because no one knows their history, no one knows their Arab culture. The Arabs believe that we've offered them in the West Bank, to use their term, is only 19% of what they consider to be Palestine, which includes Israel proper.
Now, let me just add to that. Also at the J Street conference, they added the term a confederation. In other words, they're pushing also for a binational state. Now, we have some video to show what coexistence looks like right now in Jerusalem. Hopefully our doctor in the studio could show some up-to-date video of the friendly relations that are going on.
And you'll be cut off by video as soon as I cue it up. I'll be back.
You'll cue it up. Okay, well, this is very important to make this point, because what's going on is a lot of violence right now from Arabs against Jews in Israel. They're attacking Jews randomly in Jerusalem, in Jaffa, in Lod, in other cities, Ramleh, all over the place. They're complaining also about Jews moving into Jaffa, religious Jews. There's a lot of violence going on, and it's important that we discuss that.
At one point, rioters even trapped and allegedly attempted to kill a passerby who had arrived in the area to get ice cream. The driver filing a complaint with police, explaining that he was driving on Yefet Street when he saw a small fire and decided to go around it. But at this point, a masked man on a bike allegedly prevented him from leaving, saying, quote, "You can't run away, you're dead here." And this followed by dozens more people arriving to stone and kick the vehicle. The driver then abandoning the car and luckily being helped to safety by police and others in the area who came to his aid. At least 3 have been arrested in connection to the violence.
The voice of the Jerusalem people. People here are being attacked daily, every night, on the way to the Kotel, on the way to their neighborhoods. We are right here, few meters from the city council of Jerusalem, and it's impossible to accept the situation that there is no sovereignty, no security for Jews. And I must say, everybody knew that this is the situation. Arabs were killing and murdering each other for months and for years, and nobody cared. Now, the weapon that they used, and the stone that they used, and the knife that they used against their brothers, now they are using it against the Jews. And it will not end there. They will continue. This is in their culture. And we are calling to the police to continue their work and really to work like they could, like they can. And we are calling to the Knesset members to pass the right laws that will allow the courts in Israel to be much more effective against the terrorists that are every night here doing what they are doing against the Jews.
انت مثلا تسمع عن عمليه طعن للصاغه جوا شو ردود فعلك؟
انا بفرح.
انت بتفرح؟ بتكيف ليش؟
عشان واحد من اهل يعني من فلسطين طعن اليهود. يعني احنا علمنا اليهود ياخذ درس.
تعرف انه انا يهودي؟
لا.
انا يهودي.
انت يهودي؟
انت حتكون فرحان اذا مثلا واحد طعني؟
Come on!
احنا رجال احنا رجال وبهمتنا نهد الباب يا وديع.
راحوا الاسعاف، ليش راحوا؟ في بث حي مباشر، اعتداء على الشيخ احمد ابو عجوه، اعتداء على الشيخ احمد ابو عجوه، اعتداء على الشيخ احمد ابو عجوه من قبل الشرطه، من قبل الشرطه. الله اكبر، الله اكبر. اعتداء على الشيخ احمد ابو عجوه، اعتداء على الشيخ احمد ابو عجوه. انور، وين انور؟ وين انور؟ وين انور؟ هاي انور. الان اسعاف للشيخ احمد ابو عجوه في بث حي مباشر. على يبدو كسر. شيخ سلامتك شيخ، الله يقويك. الان المحامي رمزي، الاخ رمزي المحامي. الله اكبر، غضب يافا. نعم هذا غضب. الاسعاف الاول الشيخ احمد ابو عجوه. ايضا مسدد الاعتداء على شباب يافا.
نادى في الاقصى سمعنا اصوات الاذان لعيسى وديرا سمعتها سلوان يا مكبر نادى ابليس ونادي بيت علام بالدم نحن وجود الاقصى والقران يا مكبر نادى ابليس ونادي بيت علام. الدولة وكالدولة وراء المليار. رش يا جانو رش، من الدولة للدولة، من الدولة للدولة.
Okay. Wow.
Can I comment? Why is anybody at all surprised? A couple of decades before Israel became a state, in Jaffa and Tel Aviv, there were riots against Jews in 1920 and 1921. In 1929, there was the massacre in Hebron. We had the Arab riots of 1936 to 1939. This is nothing new. These were
1 second. There's a call coming through. 1 second. Can I help you?
Hey, how's it going there? It's Jordan.
Very good.
I have a question. What's the solution?
Well, I'm going to let Mayor Jolowitz answer that.
I'm going to answer in one sentence. Not every problem in the world has a solution. You have two mutually exclusive. This isn't a war of territory. The big mistake that's made, and anyone who listens to not only not only J Street, if you listen to AIPAC, there's the misunderstanding that if you somehow draw the lines in the proper place, that territorially you push certain buttons, there's going to be peace. The answer is peace isn't improbable, it is impossible. As long as Islam continues to be Islam, and it will because it's immutable the way it is. And as long as Zionism remains a quest of the Jewish people, the answer is there is no solution. Stop expecting one. I'm sorry, I say this a little quiet, so I will say this. There is an answer, however, for making the situation quiet. A dear friend of mine, Professor Paul Eidelberg, had written many years ago in which he said, when the perpetrator of terrorism realizes that the penalty that he will pay by the state of Israel, the penalty that he'll pay, that he'll be crushed, is so significant that it's not worth the terrorism that he brings against the Jews, it will end. No peace, no peace. But the Israelis have the ability, when I mentioned these riots, 1920, 1921, Israel, the Jews were defenseless. They were stateless people. The British were in charge. Today, Israel, if it did the right thing, if it did the Jewish thing, if it did what any other pragmatic, sensible, common sense nation in the world would do, if Israel crushed this, it would end.
Well, listen, the other option is there has to be a separation of the peoples. Ramallah is the capital of whatever you want to call that Arab state. Let them confederate with Jordan, let them confederate with Egypt, but they have to separate they're not going to be under, we don't want them to be part of Israel. They cannot vote under Israel. We don't want them in our elections. Let them go and let them run their own affairs separate from the state of Israel.
I disagree, Alan, with all due respect. I disagree. I don't need the Palestinians to run their own affairs in a state called Palestine, where rockets are going to fall in within short mortar fire, 80% of Israel's infrastructure, and also 70% of its population. That to me.
But we know that Israel's not going to crush. I mean, crushing them is an idea, but they're not going to do it though. Israel's not going to, turn Gaza into a parking lot. So the only other thing is to make them part of Egypt, make Ramallah part of Jordan, but they cannot be part of Israel. We don't want them as part of Israel, and we don't even want them to be an independent Palestine, because they have to be a disarmed, demilitarized country. But crushing them, which Israel can do in 1 hour, they're not going to do it.
I'm sorry, who's going to demilitarize them? They're going to accept a political entity that's going to be demilitarized?
No. Egypt will not allow Hamas to be militarized, and Jordan will not allow the PA to be a militarized force. But we know that Israel isn't going to do it.
I will comment about that. Both Egypt, I'm going to use a phrase that was used by Shmuel Katz, who was a lovely man who passed away many years ago, one of the great Zionists. Shmuel Katz referred to the Arab world, each of the Arab countries, as one-bullet regimes. Egypt and Jordan are both one-bullet regimes. And if we think that peace with Egypt somehow is steady, I'll take you back and remind you of a name, Morsi, Muslim Brotherhood. Mubarak fell. Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood, took over. It was a one-bullet regime. Now, thank God Morsi was overthrown himself by al-Sisi. But the point is to trust the future of the Jewish state in the hands of Arabs who might be a little more benevolent than they've been in the past is foolish, I believe. Jordan, the Jordanian government almost fell 4 weeks ago. Jordan is no protector of any guarantee of peace with Israel. The answer is, and I'll give you, Gaza. If you look at Gaza, last year, Israel had 22 operations in Gaza against rocket fire that came into Israel. In those 22 operations, do you know how many Arabs were killed by Israel in 22 operations? I'll give you the answer. It's 3. 3 Arabs were killed. And we think that Israeli response military, the problem isn't that Israel is able to crush them. The problem is that Israel does nothing to crush them. Nothing.
Exactly. That's exactly what my point was. They're not going to do it.
And well, then there's the problem. The problem, Pogo, the cartoon character, 1953, the opossum. Only the older people in the crowd will remember who Pogo was. Pogo had that one of the famous lines of
of American folklore. We have met the enemy, and he is us.
Oh. Agreed. Okay.
Anyhow, I mean, there's so much more to say. It isn't, by the way, it isn't just, we all know that famous, that Bernard, excuse me, the Bernard, I'm looking at the quote where it is. It's a famous quote by Lewis, in which he basically said, talking about if the dispute with the Arabs is about the size of Israel, the negotiations might be helpful. But if the dispute with the Arab world is about Israel's existence rather than its size, then no negotiations are either necessary nor fruitful. And that's what it comes down to. The Arabs will not recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. That is the core of the problem. It will remain a core of the problem. It was an issue when I started lecturing 45 years ago. And when I continue to lecture in 45 years, it will remain the issue. The Arab world, this is not an issue of territories, of lines. You cannot take a map of the Middle East and ask anyone in his right mind, hand them a pen and say, here, I give you the authority to draw the line where you want to draw the line, separating an Israel from a Palestinian entity, and make it workable. Because if the line is favorable to Israel, it'll be rejected by the Palestinians. And if it's to the benefit of the Palestinians, it will place Israel in mortal danger. There is no solution for this problem. There are two mutually exclusive claims to the problem. And one other thing, by the way, for J Street referenced a couple of times during their gatherings on Sunday and Monday, they talked about the vision of Yitzhak Rabin. Well, Rabin, 1 month to the day before he was killed, spoke at the Knesset. It was his last speech at the Knesset, in which he said that he was against the establishment of a Palestinian state, but rather accept a Palestinian entity. And he talked about with human rights, with social rights, but not political rights. Now, I was no fan of Yitzhak Rabin, but he neglected on purpose to mention political rights, because political rights meant that they had the right to vote in a Palestinian government.
Correct.
So all these people who today quote or misquote Rabin was against the establishment of a Palestinian state. But people don't know that, and therefore because he was a fall. It's like Kennedy and Camelot became wonderful only after he was murdered. They deified him, and they deify Rabin in the same way. Rabin was the one who said that we should break the bones of the Arab because they couldn't control themselves, and was against the Palestinian state. The bottom line is we live in a world, it's funny, I'm looking at a piece here. We live in a world that there's no solution. I'm looking, here's a piece that was printed this morning. Yesterday, the United Nations, its Economic and Social Council, elected the Islamic Republic of Iran to are you ready for this? The UN Commission on the Status of Women, a term that begins next year and runs into 2026. Now, this UN Commission on the Status of Women, I'm reading this from the UN thing, is a commission that's exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. At what point do we stop fooling ourselves? At what point do we say this is insane, this is insanity, this is the real world? There is no solution that some liberal at Brandeis University thinks can be manufactured by simply getting the Arabs to accept the Jewish right to a state. It's not going to happen.
Right. Mayor, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Oh, no. You guys have 35 hours? Two simple questions that you ask these people. Israel obviously is blamed by J Street based on one thing. Israel is an occupier. Israel is an occupying country. It's the occupation. And a very simple question needs to be asked. It isn't rhetorical. It's a real question that they refuse to answer, because the answer will destroy who they are. And that question is, why was the PLO formed in 1964? The Palestine Liberation Organization, formed in 1964, when Israel didn't occupy, their term, not mine, occupy the territories until 3 years later? What was it? It was a retroactive. And the answer is because they were trying to liberate Palestine, Israel proper. The other question is asked, the same question, just phrased otherwise. If peace is attainable, why was there no peace in 1966? Very simple question. Why was there no peace in 1966? We know the answer. Because there was a Jewish state. Bottom line, just one sentence which says it all. The entire Palestinian political movement isn't, if people don't understand this, there will always be a dispute. The Palestinian political movement is not a movement to establish the state of Palestine. That's nonsense. It's a movement to eradicate the Jewish state of Israel. During the 19 years, 1949, 1967, at the end of the War of Independence, when the West Bank, to use their term, fell into Jordanian hands, it was illegally occupied by Jordan. Question, why was there no move to establish a Palestine? Because that isn't part of the plan. Next question, name an Arab leader, and if you can name him, you're better than I am. Name an Arab leader who during those 19 years of Jordanian occupation of Judea and Samaria, of the West Bank, one Arab leader who visited the West Bank, Jerusalem. Name one. The answer is you can't. You cannot name them because they don't exist. It isn't about establishing the state of Palestine. We have bought into their narrative, and shame on us. We have bought into their narrative. They aren't interested in establishing the state of Palestine unless they thought that that was the convenient method by which they can truncate Israel and therefore go to stage 2 and 3. They're not interested in establishing Palestine. They're interested in eradicating the Jewish state of Israel. It is the bottom line. And if one doesn't understand that, nothing will ever convince them.
Well,
and by the way, I'm sorry, one last thing.
Go ahead, yes.
I'm not getting this. This isn't Jewish sources that I quote. It's Arabs. If one wants to find out what the Arabs intend, go and look at what the Arabs tell us. I'm sorry, I'm done.
No, you're good though. But you know what though, just because you're saying that Arab quotes is the best way to go. They themselves have said that Oslo was just a ruse to liberate all of Palestine. But going back to the J Street conference, because they've made Bibi the bad guy here and the obstacle to peace. What none of them mentioned is that besides Bibi, since 1993, there were 5 Israeli prime ministers. There was Rabin, there was Peres, there was Ehud Barak, Ehud Olmert, and Ariel Sharon. 5 prime ministers during the Clinton administration, during the Obama administration, during the Bush administration. Every one of them supported an independent state of Palestine. And if you remember, both John Kerry and Jimmy Carter went over and met with Abbas in Ramallah when a Republican was in office and said, do not accept any peace deal under these conditions because they will never be in your favor.
In 2009, when Bibi Netanyahu made his terrible mistake because of pressure he claimed came from the Obama administration, when he spoke at Bar-Ilan University and he said that he was in favor of a 2-state solution, he very quickly walked it back, saying it was a mistake, that he was under pressure. The others actually didn't. They didn't recognize a two states. They recognized a Palestinian entity. I want to read a quote. It's a very relevant quote. You had mentioned something and it plays exactly into what you just said. I'm going to read you a quote this is Yasser Arafat. It's a quote from January 30, 1996. Now I'm going to remind those people that 1996 chronologically came after 1993. At least that's the way it works in America. 1996, 3 years after the Oslo Accords, 3 years after there was a peace treaty, 2 years after Arafat became a Nobel Peace Laureate. This is what Arafat said, okay? After signing the peace treaty, he addressed 40 Arab diplomats at the Grand Hotel in Stockholm, and he delivered an address that he actually gave a title to. Most people don't give titles to the speeches they give. He gave one. The title of his speech was The Impending Total Collapse of Israel. This is what he said. Listen carefully. It basically tells us everything we need to know. He said, we Palestinians will take over everything, including all of Jerusalem. We of the PLO will now concentrate all our efforts on splitting Israel psychologically into two camps. Within 5 years, we will have 6 to 7 million Arabs living in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. You understand that we plan to eliminate the state of Israel and establish a purely Palestinian state. I have no use for Jews. They are and remain Jews.
Correct.
What don't Israeli diplomats, what don't the people in AIPAC who support a two-state solution, what don't we understand about this? And if you say, well, that's 1996, I will take you back to December of 2016. 2016, December 2016, where Mahmoud Abbas, known in Israel, of course, as Abu Mazen, where Mahmoud Abbas basically said, we remain true to the principles as enunciated by our original leader, even though he wasn't the first head. Ahmed Shikari was the first head of the PLO. But he said, we remain true to the principles of the PLO covenant. The principles of the PLO covenant means that Israel has no right to exist. So Mahmoud Abbas, who we have labeled a peacemaker, who's a murderer, mass murderer, subscribes to what I just read. Nothing has changed. The only thing that's changed is our resolve, our ability. When you read this and you say, oh boy, this is troubling, it upsets my narrative. What's my narrative? My narrative basically says that there's got to be some kind of button that one needs to push in order to come up with a solution. There isn't. There isn't. There is no such button, not unless the Arabs cease to be Islamic. And that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's a tragedy, but it's a reality. Now, the difference, of course, is between now and yesteryear is that Israel has the power to resist all this nonsense and to crush it. No Arab, there's an interesting fact. Why has no Hamas leader ever strapped a suicide bomb belt around his daughter's waist and sent her into the marketplace to die? Why did any Nazis ever put a suicide bomb belt against them and send it against Jews? No, because their own life meant something to them. Hamas and Fatah would put the suicide bomb belt not on their own children, on someone else's children. Why? Well, they were expendable. But it also meant that they were concerned. Why don't they want the 72 virgins? Why don't they strap the bomb around themselves? Because they don't want to die. And Israel has not sent the message that you will indeed die. Israel has been trying to reclaim soldiers and bones of soldiers from Gaza. Israel, the one way to end Gaza, by the way, and it was tested before and it worked, and Israel walked away from it because people don't like it. It's a thing called targeted assassination. With targeted assassination, you end the belligerence on the part of the other side. If you tell Ismail Haniyeh, in 3 weeks, you are dead, return the bones, you're dead. Even after you return the bones, we're killing you anyhow. You're dead. And kill him. And kill his. It happened with Sheikh Yassin. Israel did that. They killed Sheikh Yassin. He was replaced by Dr. Antisi. They killed him 3 weeks later. And then Hamas named a successor. And I don't know his name. And you don't know his name at the time. Because he was afraid he was going to get killed. So Hamas said, we've named a successor, but we won't let you know who he is. It was only when Israel stopped the target assassinations that Hamas once again came out and told us who their leaders were. One last thing, forgive me. Your messenger, a good, pragmatic, practical analyst of Middle East affairs. Sometimes I do a regular lecture series, and from time to time I'll throw this one quote in because it's sort of relevant to the layman to understand what happens. He made this very simple. I'm going to read you a long sentence, which makes sense, and it tells us everything. He said, erroneous assumptions produce erroneous policies, as has been the case of all U.S. initiatives towards the Palestinian issue, which has been erroneously perceived by the United States foreign policy establishment to be the root cause of the Arab-Israeli conflict. He's 100% right. The mistake that we've made in buying their narrative is we talk about an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have bought into this nonsense. There is no Palestinian entity. They were manufactured. The Finns have Finland. The Poles have Poland. The Danes have Denmark. The Danes have Denmark. The Palestinians, they need Palestine. It was a creation. It's a manufactured thing. And I can quote also, I've got it every place,
Zuhar Marshen, who was the head of the Al Saika with the Syrian branch of, he had this famous quote in 1977 to the Dutch newspaper Torah, in which he basically said, this is a game we're playing. It is a tactic. It is not a strategy. The tactic is we will pretend that there's a Palestinian entity in order to give us cause to destroy Israel. And once we've done that, the Palestinians will cease to exist and they become part of the greater Arab nation. And at the time he was talking about this, about Syria and everything else. They tell us we're playing a game, and we, because we're so hungry and thirsty for peace, pretend that we have a peace partner. And I say what I said earlier. Shame on us. Shame on us. Shame on us. And I'm talking about the Israeli government as well. The Israeli government, Bibi Netanyahu, is so concerned about not being thrown out and go to jail that Bibi Netanyahu, who is a brilliant politician, is actually thinking of bringing in Mansour Abbas and Ra'am in order to establish a government. And then we on the right, or the right of center, whatever you find yourself, all of a sudden think that we will have the right to tell the left in future generations or future years, no, you can't make a government with the Arabs. If Bibi Netanyahu was willing to bring them in, we're an embarrassment. Forgive me, we are an embarrassment. And you wonder why Jews have suffered all along? Because Jews have, as Rabbi Kahana once said, the only lesson of history is that there are no lessons to be learned from history. That's what it is. That's what it is. Anyhow, if you want to, I can become a little more vitriolic in my points.
You are the first person to ever leave me speechless. You know that.
Well, thank you, Al. I love you, Alan. No, I'm just here. I'm sorry. Let me attack because Mayor Weinstein wanted to talk about the American Jewish population. American Jews are 1.8% of the American population. American Jews are 1.8%. What percentage of the coffers, the financial dollars raised by the Democratic National Committee is Jewish driven? I'll give you the answer. And even though it could be up by 2 or 3%, because there's certain things that are 60%. The Jews give to the Democratic Party 30-fold their number. It isn't the fact that they're generous and give 30 times their number. They give it to the enemies of Israel. The Jews, 1.8% of the population, are the ones financing the Keith Ellisons, the Rashida Tlaibs. We're not a well people. And when one stands up and says anything close to what I say, we are considered extremists, right-wing extremists, troublemakers, radicals, what have you. It's a remarkable thing. I will say, by the way, it's important. I'm a son of survivors. My father survived 13 concentration camps. 13 concentration camps. It's unprecedented. And when I was 5 years old, I'm not exaggerating, when I was 5 years old, he told me, he said, I don't fear. We were living in Israel and we moved to Africa. It was then Northern Rhodesia. It's now Zambia. And my father said to me, we will now be living among the non-Jews. And he said, and it will be difficult. And I'm telling you now, I'm not concerned about your remaining Jewish as you grow older, because they will always remind you. They will always remind you. My father also told me when I was also 5 years old, and he said, and I'm being serious, this isn't just some whimsical. My father sat me down on his knee and he said, in life, he said, do the right thing. Decent people will stand by you. The others don't count. And by adopting that policy, Mayor Weinstein, head of the JDL many years ago in Canada, I was in the United States, whatever. Why were we unpopular? We weren't unpopular with the Jews who suffered. They wanted us, they needed us. We were unpopular because the establishment didn't like the fact that we bucked the establishment. And look where the establishment has gotten us.
Correct. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I keep saying last comment. I gave a speech a few days ago, and it was about anti-Semitism. And I mentioned that we had just had Yom HaShoah, and then we had Yom HaZikaron, followed, of course, by Yom HaAtzmaut. So we have Yom HaShoah, which was what? We commemorate Yom HaShoah because it's a comment about what happens to Jews when they're stateless.
And then we have Yom HaZikaron, which is a comment about what happens to Jews when they have a state of their own or fight for a state of their own. Now, the number of people who we commemorated for Yom HaZikaron just last week was 23,928. 23,928, the exact number. And I reminded my audience that 24,000, to round it up by a few, that 24,000 who died in defense of the state of Israel in modern Israel is the same number who died in Auschwitz in 2 days. In 2 days. If anyone wants to have an argument as to why we need to have Israel, it needs to be strong, and for us at the same time, where we do have detractors, Jewish or non-Jewish, to tell them to go to hell. In fact, Jabotinsky in his Iron Will wrote in 1911, in which he basically said that 1911, when they were persecuting Jews, that the Jews need to find the moxie to tell the world that holds them always as guilty. It's time to tell them to go to hell. Anyhow, I think I'm done.
No, you can keep going, but it's not my show.
No.
Yeah.
Mayor, I don't know that. Is there? I don't know what we're doing with the show, Mayor. I follow your lead.
We're done with the show. If somebody says we're done with the show, until then, the show must go on.
Oh, if that's the case, here, wait a second. Here, and let me just, I love quotations. In fact, when my children were young, they didn't know what to buy me as a birthday present. And I would go out and buy a book of quotations. I would wrap it up and I said, on my birthday, hand this to me. And I'll be very pleasantly surprised because I love quotations. I love them also because they punctuate points that you want to make. I'm going to read you two, and forgive me. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. One finds on the walls these words of admonition, which are attributed to Yehuda Bauer, who was considered Israel's best-known Holocaust study. And the words are very simple. Thou shalt not be a victim, thou shalt not be a perpetrator, but above all, thou shalt not be a bystander. Those are the lesson. And of course, George Orwell told us that in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is the revolutionary act. Here's another quote, and I'm going to quote the famous rabbi. Oh, no, he's not a rabbi. Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa, that wild-haired, crazy musician. Here's what Frank Zappa said. Frank Zappa said, some scientists claim that hydrogen, because it is so plentiful, is the basic building block of the universe. I dispute that. There is more stupidity than hydrogen in the universe, and it has a longer shelf life.
Listen, we're seeing that in Washington. We're seeing that in Washington today, and I've asked.
Indeed,
I've spoken to Tamar Marcus and David Friedman, and I said to them with all the facts, and they present the facts not as eloquently as you do, but enough of them. And I asked them, how is it with everything that we know? The Palestinians have told us what they are, what they want, what they're going to do. How is it that we still are pursuing a peace process? And they said, we don't know. That's it. There is no answer for it. At least give me an answer. But they can't even tell us. So this is why the Palestinians, or I call them now the Arabs under the Palestinian Authority, for them, time is on their side. They have nothing to gain by making a deal with us. And as long as they're at war with the state of Israel, they're still getting millions and billions from Europe. And that's why there's no resolution, and they don't seek a resolution.
You're absolutely right. The very creation of a two-state solution, the creation of a state of Palestine, is in essence telling the Arabs, we will reward you, we will give you a state of your own if you promise to stop killing us. This is insanity. We will reward you if you stop killing us. I want to read you, again, I've got quotes every place. I mean, I use this, whatever the hell. This is George Orwell. This is George, and by the way, speaking of J Street, because this was the subject matter, J Street, so disingenuous in everything that they do. J Street was angry at David Friedman, who later became the best U.S. ambassador to Israel. J Street was angry that he had previously said that the J Street people were worse than capos, worse than capos. And if they're worse than capos, they were upset, and he sort of walked it back during the Sarin confirmation. They were, in fact, J Street is worse than the capos. And I'll tell you why, and you already know the answer. The capos, for whatever they did in collaborating with the Nazis, did so because they thought that they might save their own life, or the life of their family, or the life of their community, the lives in their community. So the capos cooperated because there was the veritable gun to the head. J Street, they're in Aspen, they're in Tucson, they're in Chicago, they're in Miami. They voluntarily aid and abet the enemy. That's much worse than the capo. Last comment, and I'll say goodbye because I think it's long. George Orwell in 1944 had a column which appeared in the British publication, a leftist publication called Tribune. And here's what he said, and this applies to the Palestinians. He wrote it about the Nazis. He wrote it about the Nazis. It applies to the Palestinian Arabs. Here's what he said. By shooting your enemy, you're not in the deepest sense wronging him, but by hating him, by inventing lies about him and bringing children up to believe them, by clamoring for unjust peace terms, which make further wars inevitable, you are striking not at one perishable generation, but at humanity itself. Okay.
And you're just getting started.
Well, I do this I have a lecture series that I do every Thursday, and I also have a radio show on Sunday. But anyhow, Mayor, I see you moving your lips, but I don't hear any sound coming out. So I will shut up. Alan, it was a pleasure to see you, my friend.
You as well. And you're right. I think Mayor's audio is off.
Yeah.
Did the doctor tune him out? They tuned the host out?
No, that's not who I would have tuned out. He wasn't doing most of the talking. So, hey, Mayor, is your mic not plugged in or hooked up or something? Do you know sign? Can you kind of give us a signal?
Yes. Wait, I read lips. He's saying this is the last time I bring Mayor Jolovitz on because he won't shut up. I think that's what he just said.
No, Mayor, you are such a source of knowledge and education and passion. You get an audience going. So you're fantastic. I have never been a part of a group before where I said, you know what, I don't want to talk. I like what he's saying more. And I really say that.
Thank you. I very much appreciate you, sir. Thank you.
Well, Mayor, if we can't hear you, I might have to be the one to close down the show tonight. And you know how much I hate to be on the camera and hate to be speaking because I'm so shy in mixed groups. But if that's okay with you, give me the okay sign, and I'll say some quick closing words. Okay? Gentlemen, this has been a pleasure. To close it, I'm going to actually play a song. It's time for a little music, I think. Pleasant music. This is not sarcastic. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this young lady, but Karen Pellis is an amazing Israeli star, born in Israel, attended a school that was actually started by some Israelis who were in music school in Boston. So she's amazing. The town she's from dates back to the Bronze Age. So she was named Israeli Singer of the Year twice. And she's also had albums go gold. This is a video, by the way, that the Mayor suggested I show. So I don't want to take credit for showing this. I'll just take credit for spending all this time doing these memes. So without any further ado, let's see if I can actually find the video. And if anybody has anything to say before that, this is your last chance to chime in before we chime out.
I just want to say thank you very much.
Okay, and we're getting close. And here she goes.
והעיר שקטה והשמיים התכסו בלטה עד התהום. זו כמעט הייתה שעת בין 40
Excellent. Beautiful.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. We're going to sign out now, and we look forward to next week.
Thank you.
Gary, I have one request. Would Mayor please send me the link to that song, please?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Mayor, he'd be glad to.
Thank you very much.